Yeah.
Okay, I get the prestigious job of introducing Harrison Kim, and he's been with us in Hawaii since 2017, and we just feel grateful that he accepted our bid to come and teach in the history department. He is a historian by training, undergrad at, I guess, what is it called? U Texas Austin or something like that. And then, of course, Columbia for his PhD. And he focuses on modern Korea. And what really impressed us was that he was really versatile. He teaches all of Korean, but his focus is really modern Korea with a special emphasis on North Korea. And since we had lost Daesuk about 15 years ago, we had kind of were out of the limelight for North Korea. So we're really glad to have brought him back and to continue that. Um, Harrison's just a great colleague. He's willing to try almost anything. I mean, he's come back to us one more time. That speaks a lot of gumption and whatnot. But he's very hardworking. He's right now the editor of the UH Korean Studies Press journal called Korean Studies, and he's been very active in getting top-notch publications. Anyway, I could go on and on, but you don't want to hear me. You want to hear Harrison. So Harrison, really appreciate you doing this, and he's going to do a podcast, whatever that means.
Yes. Ned, I can begin?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, wow. What am I the people that I'm looking at right now? You guys are true pioneers um in the Peace
Very
Corps
old.
area. And yeah, and many of you went on to become pioneers in Korean studies. And of course, thank you, Ned. Ned has been my mentor and my friend here. He was actually on the hiring committee that eventually led to my job. And of course, the legacy that Ned has created at the University of Hawaii is just enormous. And so we're all beneficiaries of Ned here, and also of his amazing parties that he still throws regularly with Kamaili. Okay, so today I'm gonna make it a podcast style, so you guys can shut the screen off or camera off or walk around and anytime you want to intervene, share your comments, please do that. It will add to the presentation. So today, the life and times of Kim Il Sung. I thought when Ned suggested this idea, I thought it was quite appropriate in a way when we are forced to encounter and deal with a new type of authoritarianism blooming in our country, and South Korea and in the United States. So I think it could be very constructive for us to think about Kim Il Sung's own life. There are a lot of similarities, because Kim Il Sung received a lot of mass support as well, a lot of mass support. I think all authoritarian characters receive or has that aspect to their political career, that they do enjoy genuine consensus and support from the bottom. So to begin with, Kim Il Sung's relationship with the Korean Communist Party, the first official Korean Communist Party that was formed in 1925, is very loose. Is very loose. So Kim Il Sung arrives into the communist movement, the socialist movement scene, not through the main Korean Communist Party, but from China through CCP, through Chinese Communist Party. So when the Korean Communist Party was founded, Kim Il Sung was 13 years old and he was already living in China's Jilin province. In fact, he spent his adolescent years in Jilin, and he also received his first education in China as well. So it is commonly known that Kim Il Sung spoke Chinese, maybe not fluently, but he was able to communicate. So throughout his life, he was able to communicate with Chinese officials as well. So this does not mean that Kim Il-sung was necessarily close to Beijing more than Moscow, because he always needed Moscow. He always needed the economic and the military backing of Moscow. But of course, but his life was much closer to the Chinese Communist movement. So the village that he grew up in, Jilin, is Fusong. Fusong. Um, he and his family moved to Manchuria in 1919, just after the March 1st movement, when the crackdowns of independence movement fighters became more severe in Korea proper, and his parents and his family eventually were quite active in the independence movement. And of course, for better economic opportunities, they moved to Manchuria. So going to Manchuria was, first of all, um, uh, for economic reasons, for survival, to make money. And if you're an activist, Manchuria seems to have been a much safer place. Um, so from this moment, we see this pattern of Kim Il-sung's life um, emerging. And this feature is this kind of being able to maneuver from the margins within various cultural and political landscape. So this is a hallmark of Kim Il-sung's political life, that he is able to maneuver, he's able to negotiate, he's able to control his political circumstances. And very often this means compromise and negotiation, sometimes taking a few back steps in order to move forward. So in fact, Kim Il-sung, his greatness, okay, for good or ill, his greatness is just like many other great individuals in history. They're able to adapt and react to various historical political moments. Yes, Charles.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned his having spent his formative years when he was just a child, really, in China. Can you just talk a little bit about his parents, where they
Yeah.
came from, and what they were doing in China?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Charles. And your background will be related to this. So yeah, so I'll just get right into it. So he was born on April 15th, 1912, and he died in 1994. So he lived a quite a long time as a revolutionary. Many famous revolutionaries didn't live this long. But Kim Il Sung was one of the revolutionaries that had a full life. And you know what? Come to think of it, your lives, in fact, overlap with Kim Il Sung's lives, because many of you guys saw and experienced the tumultuous historical events that he saw as well. You guys saw and experienced Gwangju. Many of you guys were there on the ground. You guys saw the upheavals of probably, maybe some of you guys even remember 1960, the April 19th. Many of you guys probably remember that period as well. And of course, um, the authoritarian periods of Chun Doo-hwan and uh, Park Chung-hee. The assassination of Park Chung-hee. I'm sure that's a very vivid memory um, um, for you. So he was born near Pyongyang in 1912. So he was born on the day that the Titanic sank. So in world history, April 15, 1912, the most important event was the sinking of the Titanic. But for East Asia, the birth of Kim Il-sung is another monumental um, event. His family belongs to the Jeonju Kim clan. So Jeonju Kim clan, not a big clan, not a big clan. I don't think I know any Jeonju Kimshi. Yeah, do you know any Jeonju Kimshi? Not that many. Not that many. Um, there is a famous writer of that clan, Kim Dong-in. So today there are around 60,000 members of the Jeonju Kim clan. So not a big clan. His birth name is Kim Songju, which means to attain the light. And in his early 30s, he changed his name to Kim Il-sung as a guerrilla fighter, which means to attain. No. Kim Songju birth name means to attain the essence, and Kim Il-sung means to attain the light. Okay, his mother, Kang, from the Kang clan family, Kang Pan-seok. First name is Pan-seok. She was also an activist and a devout member of the Presbyterian Church in Pyongyang. Kang Pan-seok's father was a deacon. So Kim Il-sung grew up in a very strong Christian family. Pan-seok, Kim Il-sung's mother, Pan-seok, her name means bedrock. Pan-seok, bedrock. And it is a Chinese Korean transliteration of the biblical name Peter. So Peter, in a Koreanized version, is sometimes called Pan-seok. And of course, you guys know that Peter also means rock. So Pan-seok uses the Chinese characters meaning bedrock. Um, and and even today, you occasionally see the name Pan-seok, because many Koreans even today use these Christianized Korean names. So he comes from a family of serious Protestant Christians, not Catholics, but Protestants. And although there's no record that he was baptized, but he was surely raised in a Christian household. And to me, this is kind of significant. So in this missionary work in East Asia, the monotheistic nature of Christianity, and then along with that, the proselytizing nature of Protestants, the missionary nature of the Protestant Christians in East Asia, these aspects gave these new Christian Koreans a sense of two things: anti-monarchism and anti-imperialism. So under this domain of the Christian God, there's only one God. Under this domain of Christian deity, um, uh, uh, monarchism and imperialism were contradictions. So many early activists for independence were in fact Christians. Of course, Catholics, going back 100 years before that, began talking about Western learning and the importance of technology and science, and this gradual movement away from even a very strict Confucian order and so forth. But then in the 20th century, the Protestant missionaries really also gave birth to this idea of anti-monarchism and anti-imperialism. Okay, his first lessons in Marx and Lenin was in the late 1920s in a Chinese school from a teacher named Shang Yue. And this is kind of important because, and Shang Yue is in the record books related to Kim Il-sung because later on he became a very famous historian in China, Shang Yue. And I believe Kim Il-sung continued to remember Zhang Yue even in his adulthood. His first entrance into actual organization and movement um, was under an organization founded by a radical Korean named Lee Jong-rak. Lee Jong-rak. And they had a very unusual name. It was called Down with Imperialism Union. And they were active in 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 um, in the villages of Manchuria. A lot of Koreans were living there already, and many of them um, were becoming radicalized. So Manchuria, in a way, was uh, a salad bowl, if you will. They didn't necessarily mix, but there were conservative Koreans, right-wing Koreans, who, in fact, were, for example, training to be soldiers within the Japanese Imperial Army. There were socialists, there were communists, there were also people who are becoming friendly with the Russians. And in fact, we also begin to see early Koreans becoming Russian citizens in the border area up there. Um, let's see. His first experience as a partisan soldier and as a guerrilla fighter was in the early 1930s. In 1932, he joins a Chinese guerrilla army based in Antu, and then soon he becomes a full member of the Chinese Communist Party. And there was a reason why this was a rational choice for Kim Il-sung at that time. So from 1919 to about 1943, World War II, Comintern, which was a international communist organization, also called the Third International. And this organization was beginning to be dominated by Stalin. Lenin was dead by this time, and Trotsky, a very important early communist thinker and radical party member, his power was also waning as well. And one of Stalin's key idea in beginning in the 1930s was that there should be one communist party in one country. One communist party in one country. This was very important for Moscow to be able to control and to support the right people. There were there was a blooming of all kinds of socialist and communist parties all over the world at this time, especially in Manchuria, in Far East Russia, and of course within Korea as well. And some of the most vibrant scenes of early communist um, movement were by Koreans. Um, you guys know this historian Bang No-ja, right? Vladimir Tikhonov. He has a recent book out called The Red Decades. And it's a history about this early radicalized Koreans in the region. And so, so we commonly hear of, the Shanghai Provisional Government and of course the independence movement led by people like Kim Gu, but at a much greater level, a much vibrant and influential movement was really the communist and socialist movement. Everywhere, Far East Russia, Northern Korea, Manchuria. Of course, this history becomes kind of under-recognized and erased in South Korea, um, after 1948. But it is still a fascinating history. Okay. Um, when Japan
I'm
declares,
sorry, I've
yeah,
got a
Ned,
question.
yeah,
This is Carl. When was that decade you're talking about? Because by the time you're in the
Carl has,
1930s, the Soviet Union includes all of Russia in the Far East.
yeah,
So when was that red decade?
yeah. The Red Decades uh, was active throughout the colonial period. So until 1945, between 1910 and 1945, even um, during World War II. Um, and it was in the interest of Moscow to support various Korean communist groups uh, in this region. Although there were many clashes, there were purges, there were even atrocities committed in this period of you know, and of course they also experienced the great um, relocation by Stalin in 1935. But despite these quite traumatic events, various socialist communist groups existed um, until 1945. Now,
Yes, I was going to basically, I think you were going to go there as I raised my hand. You're going to talk about the Japan experience as well.
yeah,
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 that's what I was interested in how the communists in Japan impacted.
yeah,
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. But what is fascinating is that some of the early leaders of North Korea came from this group called the Soviet Koreans. So in fact, some of the best educated and well-trained early Korean leaders were from Moscow, and they were handpicked by Moscow to go rule and govern North Korea. Um, and of course, Kim Il-sung within this picture emerges as a leader. But the first group of people that Moscow thought would be the leaders were the so-called Soviet Koreans. Um, okay, so when Japan declares war on China in 1931, and which intensifies beginning in 1937, that also accompanies a major crackdown on all socialist and leftist and guerrilla forces in Manchuria. And um, in 1935, this major crackdown leads to the Battle of Pochonbo. Pochonbo is a border town between China and Korea. And this is Kim Il sung's most famous battle. This is where Kim Il sung makes a big name for himself. And he fights a Japanese police station, a police garrison. You know, so realistically, it probably wasn't a big battle, maybe uh, a couple of hundred forces total. Kim Il sung, at his height, probably commanded about 200 soldiers under his group. But Battle of Pochombo um, is a is an event that lives on in the history within the history of North Korea as the first battle that Kim Il Sung makes a name for himself, and it is quite uh, um, evidentiary that the battle was won by Kim Il Sung and his partisans. It is likely that the Japanese force at Pochombo was very small, but nevertheless. But after this battle, um, he and his group now reorganized into what is called Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army, NEAJUA, and he commanded a small team within NEAJUA. They retreat. So even after this battle, you know, the imperial forces um, and the crackdowns were just too severe, and they retreat into Russia, into the Soviet area. So first, he travels near Vladivostok. Today, this area is called Ussurisk. It's about it's about 100 kilometers north of Vladivostok. So he and his group they venture into the Soviet territory, and then within a few years they go even further into the Soviet camp, and they remain in the city of Vyetskoye, which is near Khabarovsk. Khabarovsk, guys, is pretty far from the border, and this is where he stays from 1942 to 1945. 3 years of his partisan days, the end of his partisan days, were spent in the Soviet Union, in Vyetskoye. This is a very interesting part of his life, and uh, uh, very counterintuitive in many ways. Um, and he had about 60 loyal guerrilla soldiers with him that went to this Soviet military camp. Among them were people like Choi Yong-gun, who later becomes the commander of the Korean People's Army, the defense minister, and Choi Yong-gun is the major, he becomes the main general during the Korean War. Choi Yong-gun. Another person is Kim Chek. He becomes later deputy prime minister and also the industry minister. So there's a city today named after Kim Chek-si. And Kim Chek-si is still known as a major um, industrial center. There is even a big steel plant named after Kim Chek called Kim Chek Jetseolso. So Kim Il Sung was really fond of these two guys, Choi Yong-gun and Kim Chek, who stayed loyal during this period in the 1930s and actually retreated into the Soviet Union with Kim Il Sung. So um, his 3 years of life in the Soviet camp seems to have been both a period of rest, but also restlessness. At this time, Japan and the Soviet Union had an agreement to not attack each other. They had signed a non-aggression pact in 1941. So the Soviet Union could and Japan were in kind of a default peaceful situation. So in this kind of circumstance, Kim Il Sung could not carry out his militant active uh, independence movement from the Soviet camp. Now, but um, of course, in August of 1945, the Soviet Union does declare war against Japan, and this becomes a moment that rejuvenates Kim Il Sung. But he actually does not see any more battle from 1942 and on. Okay, so I said this was a period of rest because this is when he begins to have his family. Kim Il Sung and his family situation is fascinating, y'all. So he marries officially in the Soviet camp his legendary wife, Kim Jong-suk. She was also a guerrilla soldier, fought with him in Manchuria. They were married in September of 1940. But this was his second marriage, which is not so well known in North Korea. I don't think North Koreans know that Kim Il Sung had been married before marrying Kim Jong-suk. Kim Jong-suk is the mother of the nation today in North Korea, Kim Jong-suk. She's the revolutionary mother of the nation. But he was actually married once before that to a person named Han Song-hee. And people thought she was dead during the war period in Manchuria, in in the mountains. Um, but she survived, and later they reconnected. Han Song-hee and Kim Il-sung reconnected in North Korea. This is completely unknown to the North Korean public, by the way. But he did not have any kids with Han Song-hee. Okay, with Kim Jong-suk, um, they she gave birth to their first child in February of 1942, and this is his name was Yuri Irsenovich Kim. So his first son, Kim Il Sung's first son, was called Yuri Irsenovich Kim, and of course Irsenovich, the middle name, follows the Russian tradition of taking the father's name and then adding the ich sound. So Irsenovich is a combination of Il-sung and Vich, Irsenovich. And this is a Russian tradition of of um, of creating your middle name. Um, so after Kim Il-sung and his family returned to Korea in September of 1945, Yuri was given a Korean name for the first time. And this name is Jong-il. So Kim Jong-il's original birth name is Yuri Irsenovich Kim. He did not have a Korean name. He did not have a Korean name. And it is only when they returned to Korea in 1945 that he was given the name Kim Jong-il. Okay, he also gave birth, he and Jong-suk also had a second child, another son, in 1944, Alexander Irsenovich Kim, with the nickname Shura. In Korea, he was given the name Pyongil, Kim Pyong-il, Kim Pyong-il. He died as a child in 1947, but his name lived on, and we'll talk about that too. So two kids who were born in the Soviet military base were officially given Russian names, even following the custom of using the father's middle name. So some historians, including Andrei Lankov, a very famous North Korea historian, and people like Wada Haruki, a Japanese historian who also wrote a lot about Kim Il-sung, they have the opinion, and I kind of agree, that Kim Il-sung at this time did not envision returning to Korea. Um, not not many people saw that that Imperial Japan was ending rapidly, that it was going to come to an end in 1945 so abruptly, maybe for another decade or so. But at the same time, many people in the military also saw that Japan was in a losing battle as well. But Kim Il Sung at this time did not envision that he would have a second life in Korea. He was a captain in the Soviet military, and there were a lot of Koreans in the Soviet military, and he was on track to have a career um, within the Soviet Union. Okay. Um, when they arrived in Korea, they had another child born in May of 1946. Her name is Kyung-hee, Kyung-hee, and she's still alive today, Kim Kyung-hee. She's a member of the Central Party Committee, and she's a powerful political figure in her own right. Although she is, she has very much retired from a very active political life, and this is not just because of her age, but also because she was married to Chang Song-taek. the uncle of Kim Jong-un, whom he ordered to be executed in 2013. A lot of turmoil going on here. No great political family has a normal family life. So, so you know, Kim Il-sung's first daughter, Kim Kyung-hee, born in 1946, in a very revolutionary moment, and becomes an important political figure in her own right, marries another revolutionary named Chang Song-taek, and has a brilliant career in North Korea. And then their nephew comes along, Kim Jong-un, and blows everything up. Executes Chang Song-taek, and of course, because of that, Kim Kyung-hee loses much of her political clout. Okay. 1949, Kim Jong-suk dies. She dies giving birth. So she dies fairly young. And this may be the reason why she, in fact, lives on as a martyr and a heroine, and as the revolutionary mother of North Korea, because she dies at a young age in 1949. Of course, it's that famous um, chanting when, a monarch dies. Then it's the moment when the monarch's name lives on forever. Okay. Kim Il-sung officially marries once more in 1952 to a person named Kim Song-ae, who was a secretary, so worked very closely with Kim Il-sung. And with Kim Song-ae, he had a daughter, Kim Kyung-jin, and two sons. The elder son of the second marriage was given the name Pyong-il. Pyong-il was Kim Il-sung's original second son who died as a child in 1947. So this is a very odd custom that he creates. So Kim Il-sung named a son after a dead son. And I don't think in Korea this is a tradition, Ned, right? You don't name another son after you don't name a child after a dead child. But anyhow, this son, Kim Pyong-il, went on to have a long political career, still alive, and he mainly was a diplomat for North Korea, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. And he's still very much alive. So the fact that he named his child after a dead child, I thought that was very odd because I don't think that is a Korean tradition. Names are very specific to you. You can change your name and you can have multiple names, but not after a dead sibling. Okay. All right. So all of his children who lived into adulthood became some type of a diplomat. It seems like, giving these kids the position of a diplomat was kind of a safe way to keep them, give them good positions, lucrative positions, but keeping them out of the country was probably a way to prevent fighting and competition among themselves. So Kim Il-sung is known to have had two more kids with other people. So a son named Hyun, Kim Hyun, born in 1971, with a person who just goes by the name Madam Chegal, who was Kim Il-sung's former nurse. And a daughter named Bae-kyun with someone named Kim Sung-juk. So in sum, in his long life, he officially married 3 times. The most important with Kim Jong-suk, but he married once after the death of Kim Jong-suk. But then he also married before Kim Jong-suk when he was a guerrilla soldier in Manchuria. Um, but he also had a few other partners and had 3 daughters and 5 sons. So Kim Jong-il is the most famous son, but he had 5 sons. He had 4 other sons and 3 daughters. So, for a revolutionary who lived in who actually fought, lived a life of a guerrilla soldier, toward the end had a rather peaceful and prosperous life. Um, yeah. So let me move on a little bit more to his political style. Um,
Harrison,
and
one
yeah,
real quick
yeah,
question. The South Korean line, I believe, is Kim Il Sung actually took the name from a Kim Sung Ju who was a real patriot and was a real fighter. And Lee Kwang-in, who was a professor at Isogang, he had lived in Pyongyang as a kid, and he was
yeah,
told that this Kim Il Sung was going to speak. And when he showed up to speak in 1945, they were expecting some elder statesman, and it was just this young kid, the guy you're talking about. And so he said
yeah,
you could see he was abroad. Is there what's
yeah.
that story?
Yeah, thank you, Ned. So there is a legend. So a legend that emerged from the Manchurian um, fighting and activism was that there was this kind of mythical soldier figure named Kim Il-sung. Um, and some people say he was a real person. Some people say he was kind of a veteran, kind of like a Young figure, with superpowers and so forth. Um, so when the public actually saw Kim Il-sung for the first time, they were quite surprised because he was only 33 years old. 33 years old in 1945 when he makes his first speech in Pyongyang. Um, we don't know if Kim Il-sung, there was another figure called Kim Il-sung or an actual person, but we know that um, um, even in the 1930s and 40s, there was a legend formed around his name. And that had to do with his battle and his victory at Battle of Pocheonbo and this return that he makes in 1945 and so forth. But Ned, this period is in fact kind of still shrouded in mystery. So um, we don't think he was like Ho Chi Minh, who had a long career as a soldier and a general in the field commanding warfare. I don't think Kim Il Sung's Manchurian days, Manchurian guerrilla days were not that long, maybe 5 years, maybe 5 years at the most. And we have actual very little record of the battles that he engaged in. Of course, the North Korean records are full of his battles, but actual records are hard to find. Okay, Once he returns in 1945, the first group that the Soviet Union chose as leading figures of North Korea were Soviet Koreans. And with people like Hogai. Hogai was a very important figure, very well trained, a party member, and initially Hogai was in charge of party membership because he was so well trained and knew how to organize uh, the party. But Kim Il-sung, before entering North Korea, went to Moscow, met with Stalin, and received his support as a kind of an outsider, a 33-year-old figure going to Stalin in Moscow and then saying, "Hey, I have a team. I will also go into North Korea and help rebuild the country and work with SCA, the Soviet civil administration that controlled North Korea from 1945 to 1948. That is kind of a counter organization to the U.S. Army military government in the southern part. Anyhow, what is important is that from 1940 on, we see Kim Il-sung also amassing power. But at this time, there were other powerful partners. For example, Park Han-young from the South Korean Workers' Party group, the South Korean Socialist Circle. There were also the Soviet Koreans, and there were also the Chinese Koreans who had come into Korea from China after the after winning the Chinese Civil War in 1949. So, and they numbered around 200. So this is a fascinating history as well. And someday maybe I will take on this project too. But there were a few hundred Koreans who were loyal soldiers in the Communist Party and fought with Mao Zedong and even went on the Long March. And one prominent figure was a general named Mu Jung. And then he was a central figure in the early days of North Korea from 1945. He died during the Korean War, but nevertheless, the Chinese Koreans were also a very important figure. So this kind of in this kind of diverse landscape, here's what we can how we can categorize. The Soviet Unions were elite party organizers. They knew how to run the party. They knew how to run the propaganda machine. The Chinese Koreans, they were soldiers. They knew how to wage war. They knew about tactics because they fought in the Chinese Civil War. Two very powerful camps. And of course, the Southern Socialist circle, led by Park Han-young, they were the philosophers. They were the theorists. Park Han-young, a brilliant Marxist theorist, he even studied in Moscow at the Lenin School. And it is known that Park Han-young were in fact friends with Ho Chi Minh. They both had studied in Moscow together. So Park Han-young was the theorist, the brain, the philosopher. The Chinese Koreans were the military specialists, and the Soviet Koreans were party strategists. And within this kind of landscape, Kim Il-sung emerges as the political leader. So what this tells me is that from early on, Kim Il-sung was foremost about negotiating and compromising various groups. He did not take on the big power positions early on. So for example, the first head of state title was given to Jo Man-sik from the Democratic Party, who had moved to Northern Korea. Um, um, and in fact, his style emerges from this area, and I think we can say that that he ruled with this intention to gain loyalty. Did he punish and execute? Yes, but these were, in fact, minor symbolic actions. And in North Korea, which is different from China or Soviet Union, there were no mass executions. And we still have no evidence that there were any type of mass executions in North Korea. This was simply not the style of ruling beginning with Kim Il-sung. Now, of course, North Korea did go through that horrific period of famine in the late 1990s that killed maybe up to 2 million people. And when you consider that the state is primarily responsible for this kind of disaster, then of course, then you see, you can say that the millions of deaths from the famine were in fact caused by the state. But direct executions by the state, the number is very small, and they're always very symbolic. So people like Park Kon-young, the philosopher and the theorist, communist theorist, he is executed in 1954 for having connections to the U.S. military, for example. But these are symbolic events. And in fact, the essential quality of Kim Il-sung's rule is about exoneration and rehabilitation. The most powerful way Kim Il-sung ruled was that, okay, you are demoted. Now you are to go to the countryside to a factory. But that's not it. He brings them back. He brings them back. And that's his style. He brings them back and gains even more loyalty from these individuals. So within this kind of a political style, what is important is this sense that anybody can be punished, but then anybody can be forgiven. And that is the kind of like the generous power of Kim Il-sung. And this is also related to kind of like the old Joseon style of kingship, where the king has the ultimate power to exonerate and to forgive. And Kim Il-sung clearly used this strategy. Yeah, Charles.
I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about the bringing of Japanese after the war. Once during the 50s, I think it was, that there was a big push to get the Koreans in Japan to come back, to come home again.
Yeah.
And they didn't fare too well, I don't think, did they?
Yeah, Charles, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. That could be maybe that can be my next full talk. It's a fascinating figure. So beginning in the late 1990s, North Korea begins to start this tremendous project, and that is to bring all the Korean diaspora in the world back to North Korea. So not South Korea, because South Korea was publicized as extremely poor and in turmoil and controlled by the US military, and there were clear signs, right? All these US military bases and all these factories, where people are almost enslaved with little wage and so forth. So that was the image that was publicized. But hey, you guys were there. You guys were there. In the late 1950s and early 60s, South Korea was impoverished. impoverished, while North Korea at least were rebuilding. And that project was national. So everywhere you went in North Korea, you saw changes. So now, of course, I mean, South Korea really picked up in beginning in the 1970s and surpassed by 50 times, clearly. But at least in the late 1960s and in the late 1950s and the 60s, North Korea seemed far better off. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So in this given this kind of economic circumstance, North Korea launches this incredible project to bring the diaspora back to Korea, but not South Korea, to North Korea. So there were a couple of categories. First was North Koreans who were sent to Europe during and after the war. They were all brought back. We're talking about babies, orphans, and students who were sent to Eastern Europe, everywhere from Romania to Hungary to Poland. There were tens of thousands of them. This is also a kind of a hidden history that's emerging today. There are a few documentaries about this now, and I'm writing a book chapter on this. Well, I'm writing an edited volume with a colleague, and my chapter is about these orphans that North Korea sent. Um, uh, North Korea sent upwards of 2,000 orphans to Poland and to Hungary and Romania. They were brought back. Koreans in China, they were welcomed back to Korea proper as well. So this is another hidden history. But even under Mao in the 1960s, North Korea actually welcomed tens of thousands of Koreans from China proper, especially when they were going through the Great Leap Forward and the disastrous economic consequences from the Great Leap Forward, uh, including a famine in China. North Korea welcomed Koreans back into North Korea. And the third group were Koreans in Japan. They were the biggest. Beginning in 1959, December, to 1982. So it lasted. It lasted for over 2 decades. North Korea brought close to 100,000 Korean Japanese to North Korea. It is, and this history is now emerging, and we're finding out a lot of details about this. 100,000 people from Japan. They were mostly Korean men, but a lot of them were Japanese wives and children, but mostly Korean men and Japanese wives moving to North Korea beginning in December of 1959. Now they were originally brought to North Korea as specialists, as technicians, as engineers, because many of them were highly educated, and also as investors. Many of them were, so-called had made money in Japan through various ventures, including operating the pachinko parlors and so forth. Very close connection between early Korean Japanese pachinko parlor owners and North Korea. Very early connection. So some of the powerful figures of Chongnyeon organization in Japan, the General Federation of Koreans who had aligned themselves with North Korea. The biggest investors and funders of that group were pachinko owners, and many of them, of course, part of um, um, part of organized crime.
Yeah.
There's a
Harrison, could I
reason.
interrupt you?
Yeah, Carl. Yeah,
The a huge amount has been written about the Korean residents in Japan
yeah,
repatriating to North Korea. Quite a
right.
lot. And a lot of it written about the Japanese government's cooperation or support in it, particularly the early years, and the role of Choso-ren, which is Chongyan, which you just mentioned.
Yeah,
I'd like to change the subject back to Kim Il-sung.
yes,
Uh,
yes,
I have
yes.
just
We may need to
a,
finish. Yeah,
a question about the return of Kim Il-sung and the return of the other people you mentioned under for the Soviet civil administration. A lot, as you know, has been written about in contrast for the United States military government, US military government in South Korea, how compared to what was a very well studied and prepared plans for occupation of Japan by the United States, very little or almost no preparation for the US occupation of South Korea.
yeah,
And my question is, although the way the war ended was very sudden with Japan's collapse, since the Soviet Union had fought a war with Japan that ended up in the non-aggression treaty, they had actually fought battles which the Soviets had actually won and beaten the Japanese back in Mongolia. Is what is known actually about Soviet initial or pre-planning for the administration of the territory that they controlled north of the 38th parallel, and
yeah,
the context in which they may have sponsored or permitted leaders to come back or sent them, such as Kim Il-sung or others that they've sent, but also to the extent that they were permitting others to come, like others who Park Han-young and others who went north from the Seoul, where they had all thought the capital of Korea would continue to be, so the domestic leftists together. I'm just interested of whether if the archives have all been open and if much is known about pre-planning or there are simple assumptions
yeah.
that it was similar to Soviet preparations for Eastern Europe.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Carl. You're absolutely right. We know quite a bit today about the U.S. military government in South Korea and their intention, which was really to protect Japan and to really work with Japan in rebuilding South Korea, and with very little knowledge of the local um, political circumstances. And of course, with this kind of a top-down style of ruling in 45, 48, and kind of leading to a very chaotic condition, um, you know, um, within which the Jeju April 3rd, 48, massacre and uprising is an example. So there are clear differences in the North, clear differences. Um, but it's not all rosy either. So in the beginning, when the Soviet Union begins to occupy North Korea, there was an enormous amount of looting and confiscation of the industrial infrastructure. Of course, Japan had built it, and the initial North Korean government was trying to revive it. And then and early on there was this whole taking, confiscating of equipment, infrastructure by the Soviet military. Of course, I mean, they probably thought they had the authority to do that. So, but at the same time, there was a much higher level of tolerance and trust in local Korean organizations. These things called people's committees. Um, and two very important examples. So in March of 1946, um, the people's committees that had organized themselves into what is called the North Korean Provisional People's Committee, which later becomes the Supreme People's Assembly. So in North Korea, the legislative organ is called SPA, Supreme People's Assembly. And the incipient form of that was the People's Committee. Anyhow, in March of 1946, this Provisional People's Committee, which later becomes the SPA, launches a major land reform. Let's see, it confiscates 90% of land that's owned by Japanese landowners, large Korean landowners, churches, temples, and they are redistributed for free to over 700,000 households. Most of these people had never owned land before. This was an enormous revolutionary moment. For free, for free. Confiscation and so confiscation without payment, without compensation, no compensation, and then redistribution for free to over 700,000 households. So for poor Korean peasants at this time, this was, and of course, publicized as a taste of socialism. So this was a different kind of world that they were experiencing, right? This kind of delirious moment of socialism that was very, very much tangible. Second, later that year, the complete nationalization of industries. And we're talking about entire sectors: chemical, steel, railroad, transportation, education, shipbuilding, forestry, fishery, everything, nationalization. Now, many of these industrial infrastructure, all of them actually, were established by Imperial Japan, with companies like Nihon Steel and, of course, Nihon Nitrogenous fertilizer factory, which becomes a very important bomb making and fertilizer making factory in the city of
Then
Hamhung
Hungnam.
and Hungnam, Hamhung
Yeah.
and Hungnam areas. So from early on, the what the local organizations like the People's Committee were able to do were far greater and influential than any local organization happening in South Korea.
So were
So,
those Soviet led or simply Soviet acquiesced? Or that was sort of the question I asked. Was there an agenda that the Soviets brought or guidelines? I've read about those and
of
I'm
course,
familiar with what you're talking about, but I'm just
yeah,
curious as to if anything's bubbled up or they're saying let's keep this revolutionary situation going.
yeah. The People's Committees, they could not do this without Soviet help, of course, of course. I mean, did the Soviet Union direct them? Probably not, because the local situations, the Soviets had no clue. But did they fund and finance and probably participate in the tactics and the strategy? Absolutely, absolutely, right? So when you're confiscating um, land, it is foremost a violent process, violent. So you do require security, and the Soviet Union were essential in providing security. And at this time, we know that at least 100,000 landlords from North Korea went to South. So that's another important event that took place here: a mass displacement and migration from the north to the south. There are some interesting research being done about this moment with things like currency exchange. um, cash exchange and the trade, the black market trade that was very active, probably until the mid 1950s, between North and South.
Weren't there also a lot of Christians who went south at that time? Isn't that the case?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Especially wealthier Christians. Many ordinary Christians in the North, many of them were supportive of the socialist project. Many of them were farmers, and they were, of course, they welcomed this kind of a new kind of land reform and industrialization, and opportunities were better if you were not a landlord in North Korea. Ned, how much longer?
Good question. Maybe we should give you a chance just to conclude, because
Yeah.
usually our speakers go for maybe 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and you are, yeah, I mean, we're wearing you down, or
Yeah.
you're wearing anyway. But we want to
Yeah.
give you a
Let me,
break.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
why don't you just
Yeah.
give a quick conclude and see if
Yeah.
other
Let
people
me,
might have some.
yeah, I will conclude. And then I have to go see my mother. My parents also live here too. And um, yeah, so the 1960s, when we see, first of all, a kind of a détente between the Soviet Union and the United
You know,
States.
Harrison, just for a
Yeah.
second, this has been to me a real fascinating talk, and I was just wondering maybe you could come back again sometime, maybe in the fall, and just pick up, say, where you've left off, like
Uh,
1960s on.
Yeah, I
And
could do that too. Yeah, I could
yeah,
do that too.
because your podcast, at least from my perspective, seems to have worked pretty well.
Yeah.
And
Well then,
but
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well then let me just talk about the war, and then we can end.
yeah,
Yeah.
real brief, because we have to finish off it by 4:30.
Oh, that's right. It's 10 o'clock. It's 10:15 on the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
for the yeah, you and I are fine, but
Ed and David, yeah. For the bakers and the McCanns. All right. Yeah, so the Korean War, devastating for North Korea. Absolutely devastating. And it also fractured the elite political world too. Mistrust, promises broken, and this is where the southern faction of the socialist landscape, the communist landscape of Korea, were devastated because they had promised a revolutionary uprising in South Korea. It did not happen, but in fact, this kind of fractured scene galvanized Kim Il Sung and his small partisan Manchurian group. And they were the ones who began to publicize how the Soviet Koreans were no help, and Southern communists were in fact traitors, and so forth. And from the Korean War, Kim Il Sung, in fact, emerges as even a more powerful ruler, and from which the partisan faction that were loyal to Kim Il Sung in Manchuria um, become the dominant force within the Communist Party. But the 60s, it's also a very fascinating moment. North Korea, there was a period from the 60s and the 70s when North Korea became a darling among the revolutionary third world landscape as a model country. So, hey, you guys probably experienced this too. When there were advertising in the New York Times, interviews in American newspapers, there were publications on Kim Il Sung in and quite become, being read by radical students. Um, so the heyday after the Korean War, 60s and 70s. Maybe I can come back and talk about that.
good.
Thank you, guys.
Why don't
Yeah.
why don't we give Harrison a big round of applause? And what some of you, I mean, Charlie's had some good questions. Carl's had some
Yeah,
questions.
absolutely, Carl and Charles. Thank you.
Guys, you got any guys and gals, anything else you want to raise with him before he runs off and we run off to our adventures?
I
Now,
have
now,
one.
I'll, oh yeah.
I have one. I'm one of the things that impressed me about your talk, and this is meant a little bit as humor, but not completely, is what a good job that Kim Il Sung does of having propagating the Chunju Kim clan. A few more 100 years and he'll rival the Chunju Ishi.
You know what? That is, oh my, Carl, that's a good point. Chunju Kim clan, they have established this monarchy in the northern half. That is true. You know, next time I would also love to hear from you guys on your experience of this negative propaganda about North Korea you guys saw in South Korea in the 60s and 70s. I'm sure that was very vivid to you guys.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, I wanted to just mention something, Harrison. You mentioned the heyday of North Korea being in the 60s and 70s. I would and you were got your degree at Columbia. I was a graduate student at Columbia in beginning in 1969 and then into the 70s. And I
Wow.
remember actually there was a magazine that was popular among leftists at the time called Ramparts. I don't know if you ever
Okay.
heard of it.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
And one of the editors of Ramparts came back from North Korea and came to Columbia. I was given the task of translate. He had some record albums from North Korea.
Wow.
And various songs that were sung by the kindergartens of Pyongyang. And I was
Whoa.
given the task of translating the titles of these songs into English.
No
Which was
way.
a lot of
No
fun.
way.
And
Wow.
of course, this editor from Ramparts magazine was touting how wonderful a place North Korea was.
Wow.
And he gave a
Wow.
talk at Columbia to that effect.
North Korea's revolutionary culture at Columbia in 69.
In 69, 70, yes, that's right.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that,
69
Charles.
In 69, 70 in Cambridge, I was demonstrating. I was certainly not a leader, but I was demonstrating with a group down at MIT around the MERV missile production or something, and we were chanting. I just told a Chinese couple from China who's visiting their daughter in Pittsburgh. We were chanting "Mao Mao, be like him, dare to
No.
struggle, dare to
Yeah.
win." So
Wow.
that's
Well,
a
Frank,
flashback.
that's amazing. That's part of your past, huh? Yeah.
Are you
That's
now, or
amazing.
have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, Goldberg?
Me? Oh, I refuse to answer on the
Oh,
grounds
that
that
was Frank. Yeah,
me.
that was
What
Frank.
a
I'm
different
sorry.
world. What a different world. In maybe even more liberal than today.
Us, you mean?
Well, you better watch out today. I mean, they're out
Yeah.
to get you today.
Yeah.
They're taking a page from Kim Il Sung's manual here in our own country.
Well, I mean, that is his buddy, you know, right now, Kim Jong-un and that other guy in Washington. I mean, they're real close buddies. So
Yeah, well, there's that love
They
You
are.
don't
affair.
know what's going to happen.
Yeah, they are.
in a month, Harrison's recent PhD student is going to be speaking on Pak Chung-hee, a guy by the name of Rob York, and
He's very good.
basically Harrison set us up for that one, or helped us prepare for that. So
Great.
we want to thank
Thank you.
Harrison.
Thanks,
getting us
Harrison.
that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Yes, he's very good. Thank you, guys.
And Harrison, we heartily welcome you to come back and do part 2 of Kim Il Sung.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it. Part 2.
You're
Okay.
here.
That
Very
sounds
good.
wonderful.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Ned. Thanks, friends.
Thanks, Harrison. Yeah.
Thanks, Harrison.
Thank you.
Thanks.
No,
So Frank, any concluding words you wish to make?
Ned, you're doing a wonderful job, recruiting
yeah.
these scholars from Hawaii. I really appreciate it.
What else do we have to do out here?
My network is pretty much exhausted. Although I got Dave McCann on the back burner.
My God. How does that feel, Dave, being on the back burner?
It's on my back burner right now.
And Ed Baker too. We got a few options. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, thanks, Ned. That was really great.
Okay.
That was wonderful today. I really enjoyed it.
Really good. Yeah.
So
Good to
we know
see
how to handle a podcast now.
I'm still recording. Thanks. Thanks for the